Good evening, everyone. I'm PJ O'Neill, serving as Branch Chief for STEM Training and Youth Programs. Welcome to this month's Tech Talk, the science and safety of galley operations. Tech Talks are sponsored by the U.S. Coast Guard, Coast Guard Auxiliary, and the Boy Scouts of America Sea Scout Program. Tech Talks are held on the fourth Tuesday of the month at 2100 hours Eastern Time. The next Tech Talk will be on February 27th, and the topic will be Marine Navigation Charts, presented by Lieutenant Commander Doig, a commissioned officer in NOAA. Just a reminder, this Tech Talk is being recorded and will be posted on both Sea Scout and Aux Scout YouTube channels. If you have not subscribed to either channel, please do so. Share the YouTube channels with your shipmates that could not join in tonight. Recorded Tech Talks make excellent training in your ship or in your flotilla. You can use just a portion of the Tech Talk or the entire Tech Talk for training purposes. Tonight, I have an easy introduction for our subject matter expert. It's me. So let me share my screen and let's talk about the science and safety of galley operations. So a little bit about myself. If you've logged into Tech Talks before, usually I'm your host and I filter the questions and answers at the end. But I do have an area of expertise, thanks to the Coast Guard Auxiliary, to share with you tonight. A little bit about my background in galley operations. If you're new to the boating world, which if you're a Sea Scout or auxiliarist, I doubt that you're new, but galley is a kitchen aboard a boat or a ship. Some of my experiences in the Coast Guard Auxiliary have allowed me to work, cook, and manage inventory on several Coast Guard cutters, which I've pictured here: the Coast Guard cutter Legare, the Coast Guard cutter Rankin, Coast Guard cutter Beluga, and the Coast Guard cutter Tampa. I've also had several assignments to shore stations and sectors as well. Just for an example, on the Coast Guard cutter Legare, while I operated in that galley, I prepared and served over 18,000 meals. It'd be about 350 per day, as well as inventoried, managed, and stored over $50,000 worth of dry goods, produce, dairy, meat, and eggs. That's a very large shopping bill. Now, how did I get to have the experience of working alongside the active duty in the galleys of these cutters? Well, it's thanks to the Culinary Assistance Program in the Coast Guard Auxiliary, where you become trained in culinary skills, in safety, in sanitation, in product management, and once trained and qualified, eligible to assist the active duty in galleys ashore and afloat. But really, that's enough about me. What we're really here to talk about tonight and learn about is how to safely prepare food for your crew on your boat, and maybe take a look at a more commercial galley, something a little larger. So we're going to start off and just look at various types of galleys that you might come across. This galley is from a 40-foot catamaran. It's a very nice setup. We have 3 heating elements here. We have an oven, a stove, a microwave. We have running water, refrigeration. We have counter space. But galleys come in all shapes and sizes. Some galleys, on a small sailboat, you may have some sort of alcohol burning stove with running water. We have 2 examples. You could have an electric cooktop. I've also seen galley boxes, portable units with very simple gear. Or it could be a full-size kitchen on a yacht. All sorts of shapes and sizes. There's also galleys on Coast Guard ships. The top photo is the galley on the Beluga. That's an 87-foot patrol boat. There's 10 crew members. That picture is the whole galley. Compared to the bottom, the galley aboard a 270-foot cutter where the cooking equipment is of industrial scale. So galleys come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. However, the skills needed to safely operate in any galley are basic. They apply to galleys small and large. Now here is a real danger of cooking while afloat. Waves in your cakes. Liquid batter does not like waves. It just never sets right. So it opened with a little humor, right? As we look out one of the portholes, this is a calm day on a Coast Guard cutter in the Pacific. And as you can see from the porthole, it goes from sky to ocean. And so while you're trying to cook in an oven, you will never, ever get a perfect cake. But on to the real meat of the galley safety. Right? We need to learn why it's important to work in a clean and safe kitchen for your safety and for the safety of your crewmates. Now, here's some terms to start off with. They're very general, but safety, you want to say it's a behavior that will prevent harm, right? That's before something bad happens. We're all familiar with accidents. Unfortunately, I am myself, and I'll share one a little bit later. Right? But that's an event that happens when unsafe behaviors occur near a hazard, usually unintentional. Right? An inspection is to look for the certain hazards, right? So I started off with a picture of a fire because that's probably what comes to mind when we think of a hazard in a kitchen. There's heat, right? There are flammable ingredients and flammable materials, especially on a boat. Fire is very real. Now, this is not a boating statistic. This is a domestic statistic about houses and home fires. But this statistic shows the number of deaths, injuries, property damage, over 172,000 structure fires caused by cooking equipment. So while that's not particularly about boating, we can take the danger of the kitchen and extrapolate that to the danger in the galley, right? Fire is a serious danger. So hopefully, if you have a galley, you have a fire extinguisher. Now, fire extinguishers, I'm not going to go into a whole lesson about this, but they are rated A, B, C, D, and K. Many of us have ABC fire extinguishers that will put out fires that are burning paper, burning wood. If it's an ABC, flammable liquids, electrical fires. We probably on our boat wouldn't have a D-rated fire extinguisher because those are more on industrial type boats with metals that are flammable. But the important one is in a galley, if you're cooking with any type of oil, A, B, and C may actually make the fire worse. So you may have been trained on your fire extinguisher, you know to point it at the base, you know to sweep, but you might actually be pushing the fire onto other flammable surfaces. So type K is the fire extinguisher that will extinguish fire of cooking oils and of fats. And if you're reading the infographic on this side, class F, it's because I got this graphic from an international yachting company. In the United States, we call these types of fires class K, which is cooking liquids like oil or fats. And in Europe and Australia, they'll call it class F, and they sell yachts around the world. But there's something else that you should have in your galley, and it's much simpler, particularly if you have a small galley. You should have the fire extinguisher, but you should also have a fire blanket, right? I have a fire blanket in my own kitchen here at home, and a fire blanket will smother the fire. It removes the oxygen, right? So fires often in the kitchen will start in something small, particularly on a cooktop. Something reaches the point of combustion, the high enough temperature, and will burst into flame. If not dealt with, there's going to be danger and damage from smoke And of course, the fire can spread. These specialized fire blankets are made of materials that will take away the oxygen source and put the fire out. They do work. There are some common hazards besides fire, right? These are more personal hazards that we can control, and we'll talk about how to practice safety, those safe behaviors, right? Falls, burns, cuts, shocks, poisoning. And although we won't talk about choking, be aware that that is always a hazard whenever we have food served, whether you're at home or afloat. Now, falls is pretty simple, right? But particularly on a boat, we're on an unsteady surface. We're surrounded by water, and sometimes there is water in the area in which we're working, right? So we want to pay special attention to if we are hooking to our surfaces, right? To keep the floors dry, to notice any hazards, to wear the proper footwear for a good grip. But on a boat, we also have to take into account the motion of the boat. Now, a little bit more serious, right? Falls, kind of common sense, but still worth mentioning. We move on to something like burns. It's an injury caused by heat, right? Typically fire. So while these seem like common sense, they're worth going over because I have seen people reach into a hot oven to move a rack or to grab a pan and not use an oven mitt. Hot grease splatters, whether it's in a pan or if you're on a larger vessel, might be equipped with a deep fryer that has a lot of hot oil in it. And again, the motion from the boat makes that liquid unsteady. Now, if you think back to some of those smaller galleys that we saw from the opening slide, there's not a lot of space. And you know when a lot of accidents happen? If you have a cooktop, whether it's an alcohol burning stove or it's an electric cooktop, and there's a pan with a handle sticking out, right? We want to keep those handles turned in because when the handle sticks out into the area where you're trying to move and work, where someone walks into that tight space, that's where accidents happen and those handles get hit and something very hot ends up on you or on a crewmate. At the very least, you might lose your dinner. Simple things like lifting lids of pans away from you, right? Because the steam is going to follow the opening. Things like loose fitting clothes, right, are a hazard in the galley, right? They can catch not only on pan handles, but on doors. They can catch on knives, all sorts of kitchen equipment. But a lot of this comes down to just pay attention to what you're doing, right? The galley is not a place where you want to be distracted. Like many parts of the boat or the ship, you have a job to do and you need to be committed and focused and maintain situational awareness. And one of the things, right, when you're in a galley is before you ever start cooking, you want to know what the fire plan is. Make sure that you have a charged fire extinguisher. Maybe have that fire blanket as an extra. Know where they are. Practice going from one area of the galley to the other to retrieve in case you have to do it in an emergency when you may need to rely on your instincts and training more than having time to think about it. Even if it is a very small galley where there's barely room to turn around, right? You want to know by feel where your fire extinguisher is and practice pulling it off of a mount if it's mounted. Situational awareness is being cognizant, right? Being aware of not only what you're doing, but all of the objects in your surroundings and the people in your surroundings, where they are and what's happening with them. Now, we saw this picture of an oven, right? This is an industrial-sized oven. This is from the Galley of the Legare. And I'm going to tell you about a time quickly that I lost situational awareness. So the oven doors were open, and these particular oven doors have a locking mechanism so that when you open them, they stay open because we sometimes would have to put 4 full trays on the top and 4 full trays on the bottom. Well, in rough seas, we were in about 10 to 12-foot seas, the locking mechanism failed on this oven door, and it caught my right arm as I was putting a tray into the oven. That's the consequence of me losing situational awareness. I relied on the equipment to do its job, but there was an equipment failure. Right? And after treatment, right, I was left with a reminder on my elbow why to keep situational awareness. Another risk you can probably think of in the kitchen are cuts, right? The breaking of the skin. Using correct knives for the job, cutting on a cutting board, cutting away from your body. These are all important things to prevent knife slippage. Something that people don't always think about, though, is you want to use a sharp knife. A sharp knife does its job properly with the least amount of force. A dull knife is going to require more force, which can often slip and end up on your body rather than in the food. You shouldn't put knives under things where they cannot be seen. If you have a sink and you're going to be doing dishes in the sink on your boat, right? You don't want to have a bubbly sink and knives hidden underneath there. Now, we're not going to go into much of first aid, but if you do have a cut, whether it's from the galley or you have a previous cut, the best thing to do, right, is after it's bandaged, say it's a small cut on the finger, the bandage is good, but you also want to wear a glove over top of that. And we'll talk about that when we get to food safety, why that's so important. I mentioned cutting boards, right? There are special non-skid cutting boards that are specifically made, right? We see an example of a non-slip flexible cutting mat, and they are excellent. You can buy them. You can also take the cutting board that you have, and you can get the shelving paper that is non-slip, right? And just place it underneath the cutting board, right? That'll increase the friction between the counter or your surface where you lay the cutting board and prevent slippage. If you have any other appliances on your boat, you may want to consider putting that type of matting underneath the appliance as well. Some boats will have appliances fixed onto the counter or onto the bulkhead, the wall, and that is a great idea. But if they're not, I would suggest adding the non-slip mat. If you have appliances in your kitchen, microwave, for example, right? In your galley, you might have a small microwave, things that need to be plugged in, right? Things like blenders, like mixers, depending on what you're doing, right? Just some general things to avoid shock. One of the basic rules of, and I know this is extension cord, but not exactly a plug, but you always want to pull in and out from the plug and not the cord, because what happens is you're going to get wear and tear and stretching over time. And not only is this a fire hazard, now it's a shock hazard. And we also have to be cognizant when we're dealing with any kind of plug or electricity of the presence of moisture and water, right? We want to make sure that the elements are dry, that the area is dry, because water is a very good conductor of electricity, right? And what you see is a simple 9-volt battery hooked to an electrode in the water here, and the electrode hooked to the water here, and the electricity is traveling between the two in the water. Any kind of cleaning agents, chemicals that you are storing aboard, boats have limited storage space. Believe it or not, I have seen many personal boats where there are dangerous situations where chemicals were stored too closely to food or they were not in proper containers, right? So to avoid the accidental cross-contamination, some of the cleaning agent getting into food sources, right? We want to make sure that we have a dedicated spot away from the food and we keep them in their proper containers. Or if you do transfer them into another container, just make sure that it's clearly labeled to avoid any accidents. Now we're going to move on a little bit into food safety. Allergies kind of fall into food safety, but if you're responsible for feeding the crew on your boat, might seem like common sense, but not everyone thinks of this. You need to check for allergies first because people can be allergic to all sorts of foods. There are common allergies like nut allergies and peanuts, but there are many more uncommon allergies like citrus. So you always want to check with your crew. If your crew member is allergic to one of those items, to be on the safe side, you shouldn't include it in any part of your menu. So with food safety, of course, this is protecting you. And when we're talking about some of the risks in the galley, a lot of that was for your personal safety as you're navigating your tools and your appliances and your ovens and your stoves. But food safety is important not only for you, but for those around you. And if you are preparing the food for the crew on your boat, you're responsible for the health of your crew. What we try to avoid is a foodborne illness. Foodborne illness is a large general term, right? And to break it down, basically it's a pathogen, harmful microorganisms, right? It comes through the body, through food, through drink. And once it reaches the intestines, it starts to multiply. They could be certain types of germs, certain types of bacteria, and it can cause very serious illness. Now, some foodborne illness can result in mild symptoms, still not pleasant, right? Nausea, diarrhea, fever, things like that, right? These are the mild symptoms. But some foodborne illnesses can develop into very serious and sometimes life-threatening conditions. So at the very least, with these types of conditions, if you have a crewmate who's responsible for watch or who's going to be on the helm or is going to be on the anchor line, it is not good if they come down with something that makes them incapacitated to do their job. Here's a list of some of the most common types of bacteria that cause a foodborne illness, and we will take a closer look at several of them. First, I'm going to start off with a very common bacteria called salmonella. You may know about salmonella. It's often associated with chicken, right? Poultry. It can be from raw or undercooked eggs. Often poultry. It can be from meat and unpasteurized dairy. It can be cross-contaminated onto fresh fruits and vegetables as well. But the source is typically poultry. At the top, we see a blown-up image of the salmonella microorganism. And salmonella can cause mild symptoms, but it can also land someone in the hospital. Very simply, and we'll go over a little bit later, what are the correct ways to cook poultry or the correct heat poultry needs to attain to kill salmonella, right? But always cook it. That sounds simple, but here's the thing. I'll tell you in Coast Guard training to be on the safe side. Favorite dish of some people, they like, there's different names for this: runny eggs, dippy eggs, sunny side up, and they like the egg with a nice bright yolk, and they want to take toast and dip it, right? It punctures that yolk, and they like that ooey gooey goodness. We're not allowed to cook eggs that way. Generally, it's safe, but it is not 100% safe. Unless that egg is cooked all the way through, there can still be salmonella present. So that's what I mean by cooking all the way through. Now at home, you may have eaten raw cookie dough before, but again, we are talking about a galley. You're responsible for the health of everyone. You want to take the course of action with the least amount of risk. So if you're going to make cookies while underway, don't eat the raw dough. And because salmonella can cross-contaminate onto your fruits and vegetables, you do want to wash your fruits and vegetables before preparing them. That can be just a rinse. There are specialized produce rinses that you can buy to be extra safe, but typically in the United States, with FDA standards, a simple rinse of your raw fruits and vegetables will be enough. Now, here's a really nasty microorganism, Staphylococcus staph, right? There are several types of staph microorganisms. Some affect our bodies internally, and some affect the skin, the dermitis. The possible contamination can come from the actual cook, the person, right? With unwashed hands, runny noses, that includes coughing, that includes sneezing, right? So this type of microorganism where salmonella came from the meat source, from poultry or from eggs, this is from person to food, to where another person can become infected consuming that food. The toxins produced by this bacteria are very dangerous. Staph infections are serious. They always require attention at a hospital, right? So we're just talking about some of the bacteria and microorganisms right now, but we'll talk about prevention. The commonly associated beef bacteria, E. coli. Here's the source that it's often associated with: uncooked beef, right? Unpasteurized milk products. And again, this one occurs person to person. E. coli actually stems from mammal waste products, right? I won't go too much further than that, but contamination occurs in the processing of beef. It can be present on vegetables such as spinach and lettuces because of contaminated groundwater, where a cattle farm may have run off into the water supply of a nearby vegetable farm. This is why it's really important when you're cooking ground beef, which is often a mixture of many different animals, many different cuts from different cows, and they're processed by grinding and mixing all those different parts together. You always want to cook ground beef to 165 degrees. Why? It kills the E. coli. If you ever notice at a restaurant where they ask you, how do you want your burger? You can order rare, medium, medium well, and well done. Those are all different temperatures. 165 is basically well done. Again, how people eat their hamburgers in a restaurant, right? The restaurant menu will have a little disclaimer at the bottom. We are not responsible for consumers that order, medium rare or rare food products. How someone orders their hamburger at a restaurant is not the course of action with least risk when you're trying to keep your crew safe. So we want to keep those temperatures for any kind of ground beef up to 165 degrees. The last one I'll mention um, really affects the some of your dry stores. Dry stores are anything that comes in a box, in a package, in a bag. It's not raw meat. It's not raw vegetables, right? We talk about the common term botulism. It is rare. It's particularly rare in the United States. However, it's serious and it's completely preventable. And I will tell you that I do not like wasting food, for sure. But one of the key things we want to avoid at the very basics, if you have your dry stores and you're loading things onto your boat, or you notice dented cans, right? That can be a gateway for the bacteria to develop. If you open a canned good and there's rust underneath the lid, and just a little bit of rust, to be on the safe side and mitigate the risk and eliminate the possibility of botulism, that product should not be used. And we will talk about hand washing, which is the simplest and a very effective way to avoid all of these nasty bacteria that cause foodborne illnesses. What you're seeing in this photo, though, this is salmonella growing on a hand towel, right? This is someone that, well, this would be under lab conditions, but in a real life example, right? Someone that may have rinsed their hands underwater after handling raw chicken, but didn't use soap, right? Sometimes people think that's good enough. It's not good enough to get rid of the bacteria. And if you know anything about bacteria, a little bit of bacteria will quickly grow into a lot of bacteria. So you need to wash your hands before you touch any food product you're working with, and wash your hands after you touch a food product. Soap and water is best, and we'll see a little experiment that shows that. Some things we don't think about with hand washing in the galley. If you're preparing any kind of food, it could be a vegetable, it could be fruit, it could be taking something out of a package, but where your hands touch it. You'll see sometimes in galleys, the cook, or in the Coast Guard, the culinary specialist is wearing something like latex gloves. That's excellent, right? As long as you take the gloves off after handling raw meat or those kind of products, throw them away and put on new gloves. But hand washing is sufficient. So if you do see people handling raw meat with their hands, as long as they have washed their hands thoroughly before, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, if they've washed their hands thoroughly before, and they have washed their hands thoroughly after, right, that is fine to do. But here are some common things that we don't think about. If I'm working on, say, cubing up a piece of beef, and I get a little itch and I touch my face, the responsible thing to do and the mandated thing to do in a professional kitchen is to stop cutting the beef and go wash your hands, because I have now touched something that is not the food product. And think about it this way. In a tight space of a small galley, you might be doing several tasks at once, and you have things on a cutting board, maybe things in a bowl. It's very easy to accidentally, without thinking, have an unwashed hand touch a handle. Could be an oven handle, could be a pan handle, could be the handle of a knife. It could be a bowl. And we don't notice it, but that bacteria is living on that surface. So hand washing cannot be stressed enough. Here's a brief college experiment done with an 8-year-old who was just outside to play. They took his hand and put it in a petri dish. A petri dish is this plastic dish that is designed to monitor bacteria growth, right? And after playing outside, just putting the hand there, covering it, and letting the bacteria grow, this is what we get. This just illustrates the point of bacteria multiplying, right? So when we accidentally, say, scratch our ear, or we've handled raw meat and just rinsed our hands, or we're doing something and we accidentally touch the knife handle, that knife handle doesn't get washed right away, or we touch a knob, or we grab the handle to something else, maybe to a cabinet, that bacteria is creating a colony on that surface. I just wanted to show this. This was an image that was from an experiment done at MIT, just under a black light, right? The light spots represent bacteria growth on the human hand, right? Here's an unwashed hand, and many bacteria is harmless. Some bacteria is actually very good for us, but we can't tell by just looking at our hands, right? And we can't tell what's the harmful bacteria here, but what we can see is the bacteria. With hand sanitizer, does a pretty good job, but you still see in the creases of the hand quite a few bright white spots. Here's with 30 seconds of washing with soapy water, right? There's a few in the creases here, but generally the recommendation is soap and water in the galley is better than hand sanitizer. Hand sanitizer is better than nothing. And so soap and water is really what you want to use. Regular old soap. So if you're not quite sure, how does soap and water get rid of those bacteria that we took a look at? Well, when the bacteria is on your hand, right, soap is slippery, and it's just that simple. It creates a surface that allows the bacteria to slide off. It does not adhere to the skin anymore, particularly when you have hot, soapy water, right? Now you can see, right, some of these little spots. That gives us a little clue. Where do people miss when they're washing their hands? Now, I don't have a good picture or video of this, but if you see me on my screen, right, people wash their hands really well like this. You always want to get the top of your hands. You want to scrub the insides of your fingers, right? Because you can see where little traces of bacteria like to live. It's those little corners that we miss, right? So you really want to scrub, almost like you're a surgeon. And if you're preparing food for other people using your hands, you want to take it as seriously as a surgeon because their health is in your hands. Another note about that, if you wear any jewelry, right? I've got a ring here. When you're working in the galley, you want to take your jewelry off and stow it somewhere safe, whether that's a bracelet, rings, anything like that. Why? Because that bacteria, even if I'm washing my hands, it's going to find a nice little spot between the gap of my ring and my skin to colonize. Along with bacteria, right? Well, how does bacteria get transferred? Well, we heard that some of this bacteria comes from us to the food. Some bacteria is just present in some foods, like salmonella is present often in poultry. But there's something called cross-contamination, right? There is, say, naturally occurring salmonella bacteria in chicken. And when the chicken is on the cutting board, that salmonella stays on the chicken. It doesn't jump from place to place, but we could accidentally transfer it with our hands, with the tools we use, or by sharing cutting surfaces or preparation surfaces. The recommendation is to have a different colored cutting board for each type of food product. That way you know that on a certain color board, and this is kind of the color scheme that many professional galleys will use, right? If it's white, it's going to be a product like bread or a baked good. If it's red, it's going to be raw meat besides poultry, right? Remember, E. coli especially is associated with red meat and salmonella with poultry. So red meat, beef gets its own color. Fruits and vegetables on the green, poultry on the yellow. Now, you may have to carve or slice meat after it's cooked and you need a cutting board. That gets its own board. And then raw seafood would get its own board. That way, each kind of product stays on its own board and you know how to properly wash them when you're done. Now, what if you don't have all of these different colored cutting boards? That's fine. You just have to disinfect and wash really well your cutting board between each use. And when I say each use, it's not preparing a meal. It's every time you put a different food product on that cutting board. A common order is to do vegetables first or slice fruits first, wash the board, get those fruits and vegetables safely stored, and then do the meats, and then wash that board and that knife. That way, the surface is never sharing possible bacteria from one type of food to another. Now, if you're out on a cruise that's going to be several days, you might have to thaw meat. The best way is in a fridge. Now, if you don't have a fridge, a refrigerator, a board, and say you have a small galley, it can be thawed in a cooler with ice or an ice water. If you have a microwave on board, right, there are defrost settings, and that's excellent. I've seen this in the past. I had older family members that did this, thawing on the countertop. The reason you don't want to thaw on the countertop is because the outside, think of a big piece of meat, it's frozen. The outside will thaw first. The inside will be completely frozen. So the inside will be protected from bacteria while the outside will start growing bacteria. By the time the whole piece of meat or pieces of meat are thawed, you can have a lot of bacteria in that meat. This might sound like common sense, but it's something to think about, especially with limited space and maybe limited dishes aboard a vessel. Once your meat is cooked, don't put the cooked meat back on a plate or a cutting board where you had raw meat, right? Unless it's been thoroughly washed and sanitized. You don't want to use the marinade if you are marinating any type of meat. You don't want to use that marinade to make a sauce or something for your meat, right? You want to keep meat juices away from other foods, and we'll talk about cooking meat thoroughly. Now, if you do have a refrigerator in your galley, whether it's small or large, you always want to put meat, whether it's thawing out or it is already thawed and completely ready to cook, you always want to keep that on the bottom shelf. We always put meat on the bottom because some of the juices from the packaging can leak, right? And you can take that out and you can clean and sanitize that area of the fridge. But you don't want to have it on a higher shelf because that bacteria can be in the juices and it could trickle down to products below, fruits, vegetables, even onto containers, right? And then you have cross-contamination of all sorts of food products. Now, cooking meat thoroughly, what does that mean? Well, we're not getting into cooking skills tonight, but basically that means cooking meats to the proper temperature to kill the bacteria that's harmful. And we went over some of those bacteria and which bacteria is associated with which kind of meats, right? But here's the basic kind of chart. You always want to use a thermometer. So you can have a digital food thermometer, like the one up in the upper left corner. You can have an analog that just looks like a clock face with a hand, right? And use it. There are some thermometers that will have presettings for different types of meats. Now, this is a guideline chart. When we say steak, right, you will see charts, and it is safe with steak. E. coli is less present and much less likely in a whole cut of meat like steak. Rare will start at 120 degrees. But again, if I have to cook to the galley standard in the Coast Guard to mitigate that risk, I'm going to be cooking a little bit higher to that 145 temperature. It won't please the people that like their steaks rare outside of the galley, but they can cook that at home or order it out at a restaurant. Again, when we are on the boat or we're on a ship, we're looking out for the safety of the crew member, and we just don't want anyone getting sick while we're afloat. Poultry should always be cooked to 165. And just a little tip, if you get your poultry without letting it dry out up to closer to 200 degrees, it'll be very tender. Maybe not chicken breast, but if it's on the bone, it'll start to fall off the bone. But a minimum temperature is 165. That's when you know the salmonella has been killed. Pork is 145. There are certain parasites that can live in pork, can cause a condition called trichinosis. So 145, again, that's that temperature that we know kills, that can kill pork. You might see other charts that have updated to a lower temperature, around 130 degrees. Some will say 135. Those are new guidelines coming out because of the increased safety standards in the United States. So the standards are being updated. This is just a guideline, but if it's 145, you know you're safe, right? Fish and shellfish, it's the same. Fish, they'll often teach you if it flakes with a fork, right, it's done. But to be sure, put in the thermometer. Ground meat of any kind, whether you're talking ground beef or sausages, sometimes we forget sausages are ground meat. You want those up to 165. Again, because they are not whole cuts of meat. That ground sausage or that ground beef hamburger patty could have meat from dozens of different animals mixed all together, and you can't be certain of the quality during processing that not one single one of those pieces mixed in had a strand of E. coli, because if one of those little pieces has it, it's going to create a colony. So when you cook it to 165, we know that the E. coli is killed. And again, if someone wants to order their hamburger a different way off the boat, that's okay. You want to check your refrigerator temperatures and your freezer. You can do it with a very simple thermometer, like the one that I have pictured at the top here. Right? Refrigerator should be at about 40 degrees or colder. I shouldn't say about 40 degrees or colder. Um, if you have a cooler, right, you don't have a fridge on board, you can do the same thing with the thermometer, right? If you have the ice in there, you can make sure that your food is staying stored in a temperature below 40 degrees. You don't want to leave uncooked food out of the refrigerator for more than 2 hours. Why we call this the danger zone? Food that is in an environment between 40 and 140 degrees is prime for growing harmful bacteria. You'll see some guidelines that say 4 hours. That's more in a kitchen where there's large amounts of preparation, because that 4 hours includes all the prep time, all the cooking, well, not cooking, all the prep time, all of the time that it's left on a serving line or being served. To be safe on your boat, 2 hours is a good rule for cooked foods. Now, of course, we're talking about perishable things, especially meats, dairy, things mixed with mayonnaise. And again, this is all for the safety of your crew. We're not talking about vegetables or fruits or breads or cakes or cookies or things like that. But if it's meat, if it's dairy, you definitely want to follow this 2 hour rule and cool it down before the 2 hours and get it in the fridge if you are going to save any leftovers. But just remember that the danger zone for food is between 40 degrees and 140 degrees. That's where the bacteria growth really starts. And it makes sense, right? You want your refrigerator below 40. Refrigerators don't stop bacteria growth, but they slow it dramatically for days and weeks, depending on the product. And over 140 degrees is when we start cooking, killing bacteria, right? So it's that in-between area that is very dangerous. Right, vegetables, we had talked about a bit why it's important to rinse vegetables, because there could be transfer of E. coli or salmonella onto raw vegetables, even bought from the store. Right, it's generally safe. There's a lot of very good food standards in the United States. Our food sources are generally safe, but there's always that chance that there is E. coli or salmonella transfer to a fruit or vegetable, even though they have an animal source. You mentioned maybe having its own color cutting board so that it's never mixed with meat, right? Once you, especially fruit, start cutting it up, you don't want it sitting out. Get it into the fridge, and kind of common sense. But if it's looking slimy and brownish, you may not want to serve it unless you like extra old bananas. We're getting to the end here, so I just want to remind you of, if you're in charge of preparing the food aboard your boat or someone else's boat, you're responsible for the safety of the galley, your own safety, and for the welfare of your crew. Right? So here's just some things to keep in mind. Right? We all have to sneeze and cough. And probably maybe you've learned this in school. You never want to cough or sneeze towards any food products and where you're working. You want to turn and you want to bury your face in your elbow. Right? If you do, cover your hands against your mouth. That's fine. Wash them. Never prepare any food with any kind of even a small cut on your fingers or hands. Right? Always have them covered, and the best way is Band-Aid and a glove over top. For your own safety, keep kitchen surfaces clean and dry to avoid slippage, to avoid electrical problems, but also to avoid cross-contamination and bacteria growth. Food safety is our responsibility, right? Nothing is guaranteed safe. So even when we buy something at the store, even if it's an apple, don't assume. Washing hands is key. It's the easiest method of prevention of all of those nasty forms of bacteria that cause the foodborne illness. And remember, hand sanitizer is great when you have nothing else. Soap and water does prove to be the best. And by the way, it does not need to be antibacterial soap, right? Any kind of bar soap or liquid soap is just fine. Defrost food safely, right? Keep raw foods separate from cooked foods. Don't let the two, when especially meats, right? Don't let the two touch each other or get close, or the possibility of raw juices flowing to cooked foods. Cook foods to a safe temperature. You can go back to that chart, and the guidelines are posted everywhere. Some thermometers will even have the temperatures on them with the food products. Don't keep your food out for more than 2 hours. And if you want to save your food, which is great, save your leftovers. Get that food chilled and into a fridge where it will be safe. And although I truly detest wasting food, the safety of my crew is very important. So if you have any doubts, if something looks off, if something smells off, if it's dented, if something touches a surface it shouldn't have touched, unfortunately, the best thing to do is throw it out. And so I'll end with this, right? 4 simple things to avoid foodborne illness and to keep your crew healthy so that you all have a safe, fun time out on the water. If foods need to be cooked, know your proper temperatures. If you don't know, look them up, get the chart, have it open on your phone, which, by the way, is covered in bacteria. This is a big no-no in the galley, but prop it up somewhere and wash your hands. You can have the chart out, print it out, and tape it in the galley so you know those temperatures. Avoid that cross-contamination. Keep raw foods and cooked foods separate. And as you're preparing food, wash your hands and all your utensils in between use. Cleaning surfaces constantly as you go, and your hands. Wash your hands as much as a surgeon, right? And keep food stored at a safe temperature, below 40 degrees. That's it. So I'm going to take a look in the Q&A if there is anything. All right, Eric says something you should do while washing your hands is to clean your fingernails with a nail brush. Absolutely right, Eric. Thank you for pointing that out. In our galleys, that's something that, in the Coast Guard galleys anyway, it's something we'd have as a nail brush, because that bacteria does start to grow under here, and it's very difficult to get, even if you scrub against your palm like this. You really do need that nail brush. Recommend discussing how to store food in ice chests. It's all we have on our sailboat. So, Mark, I think I might have mentioned this. As long as you're following the guidelines of keeping your food stored at 40 degrees or below, you're all set to go. So what I like to do, which I've used outside of the Coast Guard in personal life, I've used ice chests and coolers more than refrigerators, is I just get, they're like $6 or $7. I have a little refrigerator thermometer, and I keep it in the ice chest. And when you're not trying to thaw things out, you want to make sure you drain the water out. And typically, if the ice is still there, you are good to go. But you can always monitor that temperature, the inside temperature of the ice chest, right, with that little thermometer. So as long as it's 40 or below, you have enough ice, you will be just fine. Done it many times and done it the safe way. So if you're relying on an ice chest or a cooler, right, it's the same principle as a fridge. What we're really concerned about, it's not where your meat is stored or your dairy or, the cheeses and things like that. It's the temperature, right? So with a very simple, cheap thermometer, you can just keep it in the ice chest. You don't want it sitting directly on the ice, right? Keep it on top of maybe the food product, and that'll give you a better ambient reading of the temperature. But again, if you have several bags of ice in there and they're not floating in water, it's just the ice, and you drain the water out, it's generally going to stay below 40 degrees. Okay. I do see a question that's more career related. Does the Coast Guard need people to go into the food specialist profession? That's an excellent question. And the simple answer is yes. There is a shortage of culinary specialists right now. For someone that joins the Coast Guard and commits to becoming a culinary specialist, and you don't need experience, right? You get to go to lovely Petaluma, California for your training. you will be trained. There is a substantial bonus. I think it's a $20,000 right now. I think it's 20. I don't know if it's up to $30,000 enlistment bonus. If you do have verifiable culinary experience, that is, you've been to culinary school or you have culinary experience in a restaurant that can be verified to a certain level. There was a 40,000, I don't know if it went to $50,000 bonus. So there's extra financial incentives. Promotion is going a little bit quicker right now. You heard, okay, I got a comment. Last I heard the bonus was closing in on 60,000 now. So yeah, and I know there's two levels of bonuses, right? One, there's a bonus for people that come in not trained, but want to become a culinary specialist and work in the galleys and learn to cook and manage food and inventory. And there's a higher level bonus if you come in with culinary training already. But the bonuses are substantial, and the advancement is going quicker than some other rates and going to A school. If you're not, I know we don't have a lot of time, but some rates in the Coast Guard, you can wait a year and a half, sometimes 2 years to get a spot in A school, at which time you're a non-rate and you do all sorts of jobs. Culinary specialists are going to A school right away. They get in, so they start their actual career that they want to do much sooner, sometimes years ahead, which helps them in the long run advance, but also within the rate, advancement is going a little bit faster. There's a 72-hour limit on leftovers at stations, galleys, land the same at cutters underway. So Craig, by rule, yes. Often what I've encountered is chiefs don't want leftovers after 48 hours. So in our culinary training, we have a 72-hour limit. I think underway, many chiefs will say 48 hours basically because of space. Once it's brought out of refrigerated storage from the cutters fridges and freezers, which are below deck, it does not go back down, right? So there are small refrigeration units, which are used basically for same day preparation. We may put something to prepare in 24 hours in advance. We say this thing is on the menu tomorrow. We'll put it in the day before, but refrigerated space is really tight in the working galley. And once something is cooked, it is not going to go back down into refrigerated stores. So by rule, yes, 72-hour limit on leftovers. In practice, usually by 48 hours, the chief wants it gone. Okay. I'm not seeing any other questions. I thank you very much for the questions. That's very helpful to try and get the most out of the tech talk, things that I forget or don't think of. I'm very happy to share some of my knowledge and experience with you all tonight. I hope you'll join us next month on February 27th for our tech talk on marine navigation charts. Again, we'll have Lieutenant Commander Doig, a commissioned officer in NOAA, and it'll be particularly helpful as he'll be explaining and walking us through some of the electronic charts. As we know, many of the charts, or all the charts, are moving to an electronic format, and he can offer a lot of help to us as mariners in navigating how to download those charts and make personalized charts. So thank you again, and I hope you all have a good night, and see you in February.